Hello history lovers, and welcome to the Henricus Craft Chat. I'm your host, Nicole. Henricus is a living history museum that focuses on the early colonization of Virginia by the English and on the Powhatan Indian tribe that was in the area. While at work, I am a domestic skills interpreter working at the English tobacco plantation, representing about the year 1620. Historic foodways is one of the most important and easily relatable subjects that I talk about. So for today's craft chat, I thought I would share with you some of the lessons that I impart to visitors to our museum about what the English colonists ate, how they got their food, and how they prepared it. Then I'm going to share with you one of my favorite recipes that you can make at home even if you don't have an open hearth and a cast iron oven. So before we take a look at what the colonists ate, let's talk about how they ate. The English of the 17th century ate 3 meals a day, just like we do today. However, the timing of the meals was a little different. In the morning, work would be undertaken right away, followed by a light breakfast around mid-morning. The midday meal was the largest of the day and would be served around 2 p.m. In the evening, a late supper would be light and most likely comprised of leftovers from earlier in the day. Of course, without electricity, meals would have to be cooked over an open fire or in a clay oven. The length of time it takes to cook food doesn't change from then to now, but the amount of effort involved does. Hearth cooking relies on a fire and a hot bed of coals that needs to be constantly tended to keep the food at a steady temperature. Cooking a pie takes about 30 to 45 minutes, whether you cook it in a clay oven or in your conventional oven at home. But you don't have to start preheating your conventional oven 2 hours before putting the pie inside. Another good example is your crock pot. Imagine that meal that you slow cook for 6 hours during the day while you're doing something else, but instead of doing that something else, you have to constantly tend the fire to keep the temperature up. In this way, some 17th century meals could take all day, but it really depended on what you were cooking as well. To ease the burden of cooking, there were plenty of meals that could be made fairly quickly if some strategic planning was applied. For instance, baking bread was usually a once-a-week chore. The oven would be fired up and used to bake enough bread all day to last the family through the week. Another good option was boiled salads or pottage, which was whatever you could throw in a pot, and leave to cook with just some stirring throughout the day. The turning of the year had significant effect on the diet of the colonists. What they ate varied heavily by what was in season, and also when the ships from England brought more supplies. Dairy production, slaughtering livestock, and harvests all had a specific season. In addition to this, if you were a tobacco farmer in Virginia, you were most likely growing and producing only a small portion of your food on your own farm. The rest of your land and energy was given to the tobacco crop, which was used like currency to purchase supplies and food from back home in England. With tobacco seeds being started in late March, tended all summer, harvested and dried in the fall, and shipped off to England for trade in the winter, it meant that the farmers only received their major shipment of supplies once a year. Food purchased from England had to be preserved enough to last the 6 to 8 week ship ride, which meant that unless it was in season in Virginia, traded to them by the Powhatans, or grown and raised on their own farm, the majority of their food was not fresh. Pickled vegetables and dried goods were common, as well as salted and smoked meats. Things like spices, sugar, and citrus were available, but would cost more to acquire. English food has an unfortunate reputation for being overboiled and bland. The overboiled part we can almost certainly attribute to the fact that many preserved foods had to be boiled in order to soften them up again. And I do have to say, if you like spicy food, you're kind of out of luck with English cooking. However, that doesn't mean that it can't be flavorful. One of my favorite things that English food has going for it is the mixture of the sweet and the savory. The other thing I love about it is the pie. Pie gets its own category in English cooking. There's a specific difference between a pie, a tart, a coffin pastry, and hand pies, or pasties. Each of these can be made sweet, savory, or a mixture of both. So without going too Mrs. Lovett about it, I'm going to show you how to make a 17th century sweet and savory meat pie. All right, so today we're going to be making a chicken and grape pie. So let's go over the ingredients. I have everything out here that we're going to need for the crust and for the filling, so I'm going to show you how to do both. And in no particular order, we've got eggs, got some salt. This is Reggie, my salt shaker. He's going to help us out. We're going to need butter, nutmeg. I've got some dates, some orange juice, some fresh ginger, pepper, sugar, white wine. Now, you don't have to add wine if you prefer. If you do decide to add wine, make sure that it's something that you would actually drink. So I just used a white table wine that I like. It's somewhere between sweet and dry, so I didn't want to go too sweet because we are going to have sugar in the pie as well. So I just chose something that I like, but if you like red wine, you can use that. If you like sweeter or dry, that's totally up to you. Next, we've got grapes. Again, this is based on your preference. I chose green grapes. You can use red. Just probably make sure that they're seedless. Next thing we're going to have is turmeric powder. I'm using this in place of saffron, which was in the original recipe because we're just not that fancy. So we're going to use turmeric. This is for the crust. Next thing is apple cider vinegar and some all-purpose flour. I use Great Value brand because I'm classy. And lastly, you need some chicken. I'm using 3 chicken thighs today because that was literally all I could get during a pandemic. But when I'm at work, I usually use a Cornish game hen and roast it over the fire, make sure it's nice and juicy, and then I'll rip all of the meat off of that and put it in the pie. I don't have that here, and we're not doing this over an open fire, so whatever chicken you can get will do. I don't have any vegetarian options for this pie, unfortunately. So right about now, you're probably wondering why I haven't given you any amounts of anything. And that's because I don't have them. So when you're working with 17th century recipes, they are quite frustrating because they don't usually give you amounts of how much of each ingredient you need. They may, like over here, they'll give you quantities of things, like it might say 3 eggs. But it doesn't say to make a pastry, take butter and ale. It doesn't say how much butter and how much ale. Take your flour and put it therein too. It doesn't say how much flour. So unfortunately, you just have to guess. And one of my favorite sayings of this time period is, and it be enough, because people will always ask me, well, how much of this or how long do you do that? The answer is until it's enough, until it's done. So you kind of have to work with it a little bit. And it helps that I've made this recipe several times before, so I know what I like. So I'm actually working with 3 different recipes here. There's 3 different varieties of fowl pies, and this recipe came from our historic site. I don't actually remember the original source, but they are 17th century recipes. And I'm going to put a link in the description box to some 17th century cookbooks if you want to check those out. And I'll also put in the description box the recipe that I'm doing today, and I will list for you how much of everything that I used. Also, you always want to make sure when you're using a 17th century recipe that you are reading through all of the instructions. The actual 17th century recipe is just this little snippet. And sometimes they're very confusing. They're like those tests where you have to read all the way through because it'll tell you something at the end that you were supposed to do at the beginning, like just write your name. So, pro tip, make sure you're reading all the way through. And remember, when you're using recipes like this too, these are not rules. They're more like guidelines. You can switch things out. You can change it up to what you like. So some of these call for grapes and gooseberries and barberries. Some of them call for prunes. I like dates, so I'm going to go ahead and put dates in mine. Verjuice, which is here, that's the vinegar. You might also see in some recipes. I don't think it's in this one. I think they actually say wine, but sometimes they'll say sack, and that refers to wine or alcohol. You can use wine as a replacement for that. Another thing you can do if you're really worried about how much of something you need is to look up the modern equivalent of a recipe. If it's something simple like pie crust and you have your standard 9-inch pie plate, you want to make sure you have enough dough to cover everything. Well, you can go to really any modern recipe and find I need about 2.5 cups of flour for that. So I'm going to actually be trying a new crust that I've never made before. And I'm using this sweet fine pastry. Take butter and ale and seethe them together. So I don't have any ale. I have ginger ale. I don't think that would be good. What I'm going to do is just melt the butter and put it into my flour, salt, sugar, 3 eggs, and turmeric. Again, the turmeric is really just for color, but it does have a little bit of flavor. I'm sure if I had some broth or something or ale, that would be pretty delicious, but I don't. So I'm just going to see what happens when I mix all this together. And if I need to add water or more flour, then I'll do that. It definitely needs more flour. I've added flour by the handful until I got it to the consistency that I liked. It's still very buttery and flaky, so I don't think that's going to change, and I don't want to have too much, so I think it's going to be pretty good. And I went ahead and divided it into 2 halves so that I can use one for the bottom of the pie and one for the top. Made sure to grease the pie plate with butter before putting this in, and there she is. So I'm going to sit my pie crust aside for a while, and I'm going to work on the chicken. So right now I'm going to scald the chicken, which was the first instruction. I'm actually going to boil them most of the way through. Because they don't say how long to bake this for, I'm going to have to be guessing, and I want to make sure that my chicken is cooked all the way through. So I'm going to boil them before I do anything else, and I also think that makes them really tender and juicy, so that's going to help us out as well. While I've got the chicken boiling, I'm going to work on the grapes. So I have 2 cups of sliced grapes, and I'm going to add in my verjuice or my vinegar. Now I've made this pie before where it's way too vinegary, and this is very overpowering, so I'm not even using half a cup this time. I'm going to pour that in there. And I'm going to boil that with the nutmeg, the orange juice, I'm not even measuring this, I'm just covering them a little bit, and sugar. I'll use about 1/4 cup of sugar. Oh, I forgot the wine. I might have used too much orange juice. I already drank half the wine. I lied to you guys. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't even know anymore. I'm just gonna do some experimental archaeology. Whew, okay, chicken is done, and I have cut it up. I've seasoned it with salt, pepper, and nutmeg, and then I'm gonna put a little bit more butter in there and add it to my pie. With some sliced dates and some sliced fresh ginger. Again, those 2 things are optional. I really like ginger, so I'm going to use it. And now this has been boiling for a while together, and I'm going to add this to the pie. It smells really good. The recipe mentions putting this in after the pie is halfway baked. And I think that's to let the chicken get more of a chance to cook. But since we've already cooked our chicken thoroughly with the boiling, I've decided to just go ahead and add this on top now. And then I won't have to open the pie up again halfway through, because I suspect that the pie crust that we've made is not going to be accommodating for that. Here we are, all ready to go into the oven. I've put a little fleur-de-lis decoration on top, Sometimes English pies were very decorative and they would add leftover pastry from the crust and mold things on top. You can do that with pies and with tarts. Actually, our education supervisor, Josh, is going to be doing a tart demo tomorrow, so you might want to be on the lookout for that. Maybe he will have a little bit more luck than I did with the pie. I still think this is going to be good, but I'm not really sure about this crust. Now, you can, if you do this at home, you can use your normal recipe for pie crust, or you can go and buy Pillsbury pie crusts and use those. 17th century pie crusts are not like the ones that we use today usually, and oftentimes, especially with such a thing called coffin pastries, they weren't meant to be eaten at all. They were meant to stand up very sturdy and straight because they didn't use any dish. They just stood up by themselves, and the lid was meant to be taken off, and then everyone could just dig in with a spoon and eat the filling, and then the crust could be reused later. So that's a coffin pastry, coffin like a coffer or a box. And that's also something they would make very decorative sometimes. Sometimes they would bake the pie and then fill it with live birds and then put the lid on top. And when they have a big presentation or feast for the king, they lift the lid and all the birds fly out and everybody claps. That sort of a presentation was meant to be a coffin pastry. Now, this recipe that I used for this said it was a sweet pastry, so we shall see how it tastes. And because at work I usually do this in a cast iron oven, and I have no idea what temperature I'm using. I have no idea how long. I just check and see when it's finished. I've gone ahead and preheated my oven to 375. It's pretty typical, and I'm gonna bake it and see how long it takes. I've also got some thyme and pepper bread baking here. Oh, the cats really want to eat this food, but they can't. Oh boy, it's out of the oven. It looks pretty good. Even the pastry looks like it came out pretty well. I baked it for about 45 minutes at 375, and 5 minutes before it was finished, I opened up the oven and brushed some butter on top of the crust. So there it is, our finished pie. I'll let you know how it tastes. Thought I would let you know how the pie came out. I'm very pleased with the flavor. There was not too much vinegar this time, and even the crust tastes good. So I'm having it for dinner tonight with the bread that I also baked and a salad. That's all for this week's Craft Chat. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more Craft Chat content. Until next week, I hope that your crops are plentiful, your bellies are full of pie, and that you stay safe, everyone. And I put the lump of butter in there too, because why not? If you want to eat a meal with 3 sticks of butter in it, eat this pie. I'm so sorry.